Imagine the most famous critic of capitalism in history. The man whose ideas would spark massive global revolutions and terrify entire empires. Now, imagine that same man paying his rent by writing hundreds of articles for a pro-business American Republican newspaper. It is a wild, staggering paradox, compounded by the fact that he was being secretly funded by a wealthy cotton mill owner. And in his youth, he was a sword-dueling, tavern-brawling romantic poet, the architect of historical materialism, a man whose name is practically synonymous with a singular, rigid ideology, lived a life that was anything but predictable. When you hear his name, you likely picture the massive beard, the intense stare, and the dense volumes of economic theory that shaped and fractured the 20th century. But the flesh and blood, human behind all that myth, presents a story filled with incredible paradoxes, profound tragedy, and absolute irony. Today, we explore the complete, complex life of Karl Marx. To do so, we will impartially examine a massive stack of historical documents, letters, biographies, and transcripts from the Marxist Internet Archive, seeking to understand the events that forged his worldview without endorsing or condemning his politics. Before we descend into the shadows of this incredibly complex legacy, I invite you to subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Like and share this video as we resurrect the flesh and blood humans behind the myths of history, taking no political sides, but merely bearing witness to the magnificent and terrible truth of their existence. To understand how a boy from a comfortable middle-class background became the ultimate radical, we must examine the environment that forged him, starting in Trier, Prussia, in the year 1818. Immediately, we encounter a deep layer of historical irony. Marx came from a long, distinguished line of Jewish rabbis. His paternal line had provided the rabbis for Trier since 1723. His mother, Henriette Pressburg, came from a prominent Dutch Jewish family, a family that, remarkably, would later go on to found the massive multinational Philips Electronics empire. History rarely lacks a sense of irony, but the crucial context lies in the geopolitical landscape of the Rhineland. Following the defeat of Napoleon, the Rhineland was annexed by the highly conservative Kingdom of Prussia. Under French rule, Jews in the region had enjoyed civil liberties and emancipation, but the reactionary Prussian state rolled back those freedoms, instituting laws that barred Jews from high-status professions, including the law. Suddenly, his father, an attorney, faced a government mandate: change your identity or lose your livelihood. In an act of pure survival and pragmatism, Karl's father, Heinrich Marx, formerly Heschel, converted to Lutheranism around 1817. Karl himself was baptized into the state-sanctioned evangelical church in 1824 when he was 6 years old. Yet, the household was highly secular. Heinrich was a classic liberal, steeped in Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Voltaire, and actively advocated for a Prussian constitution. Growing up in a comfortable 10-room townhouse, homeschooled by a father forced to abandon his ancestral faith just to appease a bureaucratic decree, young Karl was instilled with a profound awareness of arbitrary state power and a deep cynicism about the establishment from day one. He absorbed this atmosphere of Enlightenment rationalism, but when he finished at the local gymnasium and headed to the University of Bonn in 1835 to study law, the image of the Stoic philosopher completely shattered. The father of global communism started out as a drunken university student. At Bonn, entirely uninterested in rigorous academic study, he became the co-president of a tavern club. He was arrested and formally disciplined by university authorities for nocturnal noisiness and drunkenness. He even fought in a duel. Initially investigated for possessing forbidden dueling pistols, he ultimately fought with swords, receiving a prominent wound right above his left eye. This teenage rebellion was occurring within a highly oppressive police state. Prussian authorities, terrified of a repeat of the French Revolution, were actively cracking down on student radicalism. Heinrich Marx was terrified that one wrong word could land his reckless son in a Prussian prison. In a classic parental move, he pulled Karl out of Bonn after just 1 year and forced him to transfer to the stricter, academically rigorous University of Berlin in 1836. But this move backfired spectacularly, inadvertently placing Marx right into the absolute center of the intellectual crucible that would forge his entire philosophical framework. Berlin was the epicenter of the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who had died in 1831, but whose ideas completely dominated Prussian intellectual life. Hegel proposed that human history was not a random series of chaotic events, but a dynamic logical process driven by internal tensions and contradictions, a process he called the dialectic. In the Hegelian sense, any dominant system inherently contains the seeds of its own destruction. A starting point creates its own opposite, leading to an inevitable clash from which a completely new, evolved reality emerges. For Hegel, this clash of ideas drove human progress toward ultimate freedom. Supposed to be studying property law, Marx was completely seduced by this grand theory of historical destiny. He joined the young Hegelians, or left Hegelians, radical students and lecturers like Bruno Bauer and Arnold Ruge, who used Hegel's dialectical method to brutally criticize the conservative Prussian state and established religion. In an 1837 letter to his father, Marx described an illness during which he obsessively read Hegel from start to finish, engaging in a wrestle with philosophy, realizing law was meaningless without a philosophical foundation to explain why laws exist in the first place. He abandoned it entirely and wrote his doctoral thesis in philosophy. Comparing two ancient Greek atomist philosophers, Democritus and Epicurus, Marx strongly sided with Epicurus because of a concept called the swerve. Democritus believed in strict material determinism, atoms falling in a straight line driven by absolute, unyielding necessity, leaving no room for free will. Epicurus argued that atoms occasionally swerve unpredictably. For the young Marx, that microscopic swerve represented human freedom, the philosophical assertion of self-determination against the crushing, deterministic necessity of the physical world. Even in his early 20s, he was obsessing over the tension between massive control systems and our individual ability to break free. He earned his doctorate from the more liberal University of Jena in 1841, as his radical associations had made him a huge target of the state in Berlin. When his mentor, Bruno Bauer, was summarily dismissed from his post for radicalism, Marx saw the writing on the wall. An academic career in Prussia was a completely closed door. Forced out of academia, he turned to journalism, becoming the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne in 1842. Here, lofty theoretical philosophy finally met the cold pavement of reality during the wood theft debates. For centuries, Rhineland peasants had the customary right to gather fallen deadwood from forests to survive freezing winters. As the region industrialized, forests were privatized, and wealthy landowners pushed the Prussian state to criminalize this age-old practice as theft of private property. The peasants were not chopping down trees. They were picking up branches to keep their families from freezing, yet the state threw them in jail purely to protect landowners' profit margins, who now claimed the forest floor. This experience shattered his Hegelian idealism. The state was not a neutral arbiter of reason. Its legal system, courts, and police were actively weaponized to protect the material interests of the wealthy elite, at the direct expense of human lives. Marx realized that abstract university debates failed the reality test. You have to follow the money, resources, and property. Breaking entirely with Hegelian idealism, he adopted materialism, arguing that material conditions, who owns the land and economic power, determine the law, culture, and social consciousness. As his politics radically transformed, his personal life escalated into a profound drama. Jenny von Westphalen was renowned as the most beautiful girl in Trier, 4 years older than Marx, highly educated, fiercely intelligent, and a baroness of the Lower Prussian aristocracy. Her father, Baron Ludwig von Westphalen, a high-ranking government official, had mentored young Karl, discussing Shakespeare and Homer on long walks. Jenny broke an official engagement with a perfectly acceptable aristocrat to be with Karl, a Jewish-born, radical bohemian journalist with zero financial prospects who was antagonizing her family's government. They were secretly engaged for 7 years amidst immense societal scandal. The counterintuitive twist involved her own brother, Ferdinand von Westphalen, who climbed the ranks to become the highly conservative Prussian Minister of the Interior, literally overseeing the reactionary police state that enacted the exact opposite of everything Marx stood for. The state apparatus hunting Marx was run by his own brother-in-law. They married in 1843, but Marx's aggressive journalism caught up with him. The Rheinische Zeitung was heavily censored and shut down, forcing Marx and Jenny into exile. Fleeing to Paris, Marx sat in a cafe in 1844 and had the most consequential meeting of his life with Friedrich Engels. Engels was the son of a wealthy German textile manufacturer whose family owned highly profitable cotton mills in Barmen, Germany, and Manchester, England. Returning from Manchester, the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution, Engels had witnessed the absolute horrors of child labor and starvation wages, publishing a damning sociological study on the English working class. The global crusade against capitalism was thus supported by an aristocratic baroness and a factory-owning capitalist. Jenny was his primary intellectual sounding board, his secretary deciphering his atrocious handwriting, and the first official member of the Communist League, sacrificing immense privilege for relentless poverty and exile. Engels lived a dual existence, a bourgeois factory manager, in tailored suits going fox hunting by day, utilizing those very profits to fund the global communist movement and support the Marx family by night. Expelled from Paris by the Prussian government in 1845, they fled to Brussels, where, spanning 1845 to 1848, swirling theories were hammered into a political weapon. Synthesizing their materialist conception of history, they co-authored a massive manuscript, The German Ideology, which Marx joked was abandoned to the gnawing criticism of the mice. Marx then penned his famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, declaring that philosophy must become a physical revolution. In 1847, the secret Communist League commissioned them to outline their goals, resulting in the Communist Manifesto in February 1848, opening with the sweeping declaration that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It presented a bizarre mix of radical demands, abolishing private property and inheritance, alongside commonplace ideas like a heavy progressive income tax, centralized credit, and free public education for all children. When the springtime of the peoples erupted in 1848, with spontaneous revolutions sweeping across France, Germany, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Marx was ecstatic, believing the dialectical clash was literally happening. Expelled from Belgium under suspicion of using his inheritance to buy weapons for insurgents, he rushed to Paris, then Cologne, starting the Neurrheinische Zeitung to fan the flames. But the capitalist state did not collapse. Old monarchies regrouped, militaries cracked down, and liberal middle classes got cold feet at the workers' radical demands. The empire struck back. The newspaper was shut down, and Marx was put on trial for inciting rebellion, though he impressively argued his own defense and was acquitted by a jury. The state disregarded the verdict and permanently expelled him anyway. Refused by France, stateless, exhausted, and hunted, he crossed the English Channel to London in August 1849. He arrived realizing a harsh truth. Capitalism was incredibly resilient and wasn't going to collapse overnight just because people were angry. He needed to scientifically and mathematically prove its doom, based on its own internal economic laws. But the personal cost of that intellectual obsession would plunge his family into a devastating darkness in the slums of London, a darkness from which they would never truly emerge. We must pause and grasp the sheer, devastating reality of his arrival in London as a political refugee. You are kicked out of country after country, arriving in a massive industrialized city where you do not even speak fluent English yet. You have a pregnant wife, young children, absolutely zero income, and the police spies of half of Europe are watching your every move. This ushered in the dark years in Soho. The conditions the Marx family endured during the 1850s were horrific. They were crammed into a tiny, squalid two-room apartment on Dean Street, a neighborhood plagued by cholera outbreaks and open, raw sewage. They were constantly hounded by aggressive creditors. The landlord, the butcher, the baker were always at the door. Jenny was frequently forced to pawn their clothes and meager possessions just to buy potatoes to survive the week. Marx himself suffered from agonizing boils, chronic liver issues, and relentless insomnia. The human toll of this exile is heartbreaking. Out of their 7 children, 4 died in infancy or early childhood. It was Guido, Franziska, and their beloved 8-year-old son, Edgar, affectionately called Mush, who actually died in Marx's arms. In a profoundly tragic letter from this period, Jenny describes frantically running around the neighborhood, begging to borrow a few pounds from French émigrés just to buy a small coffin for her dead baby daughter, because they literally could not afford to bury her. It is a profound tragedy that shadowed the rest of their lives. Amidst this domestic nightmare, the household dynamics became incredibly complex, with historical sources noting persistent, though debated, rumors that Marx fathered an illegitimate child named Frederick Demuth with their loyal housekeeper, Hélène Lentien Demuth. He was living in absolute squalor, grieving the agonizing deaths of his children, all while trying to write the ultimate critique of global political economy. So how did the family actually survive? Here we hit the most massive, surprising twist in this entire story. For a whole decade, Karl Marx's primary, steady source of income was a paycheck from the United States of America, specifically from the New York Daily Tribune. Run by Horace Greeley and Charles Dana, this was a pro-business, Whig, and later foundational Republican newspaper in America. Literally, the precursor to the modern Republican Party. The man who wrote Workers of the World Unite served as their chief European correspondent from 1851 to 1862. Charles Dana had met Marx in Cologne in 1848. Remembering his incredibly sharp political analysis despite their immense ideological differences. Writing over 500 articles for a paper with a massive circulation of over 200,000. Marx covered the Crimean War, British parliamentary politics, colonialism in India and China, and the intense political buildup to the American Civil War. And his compensation for this geopolitical insight? A meager $5 an article. Marx resented it bitterly complaining relentlessly in private letters to Engels about being exploited, calling the arrangement the lousiest petty bourgeois cheating. He hated doing journalistic piecework to pay the rent when he desperately wanted to be writing his grand economic theory. But the irony deepens. Because his English was initially poor and he was bogged down with research, he didn't even write all of these articles himself. The great thinker of worker exploitation literally outsourced his homework to his wealthy friend. Engels, living comfortably in Manchester, essentially ghost-wrote dozens, perhaps hundreds, of these articles in fluent English, mailing them to Marx, who submitted them under his own name to collect the $5 paycheck. The seminal text of communism was effectively subsidized by an American capitalist newspaper, with the author exploiting the unpaid labor of his wealthy friend. Yet, this era broadened his perspective immensely. He was no longer just looking at factory workers in Manchester. He was analyzing the global cotton trade, the financial mechanisms of the British East India Company, and the institution of slavery in America. Fiercely anti-slavery, Marx used his platform at the Tribune to argue passionately for the Union cause, viewing the destruction of slave labor as a necessary prerequisite for the emancipation of wage labor globally. While churning out these articles, his real work happened down the street. For decades, from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., almost every single day, Marx sat at desk 07 in the reading room of the British Museum. He devoured massive volumes of economic data, thousands of pages of parliamentary blue books detailing horrific factory conditions, and meticulously studied classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Obsessively hunting for the core of capitalism, he searched for the exact mechanism of how capitalism exploits the worker. He finally distilled decades of research into his magnum opus, Das Kapital, publishing Volume 1 in 1867. To explain the math of exploitation, Marx introduced the theory of surplus value. He asked a simple question: where does profit actually come from? Capitalists buy raw materials, machinery, and labor power, combine them to produce a commodity, and somehow end up with more money than they started with. Marx argued that human labor is the unique commodity that produces more value than it costs to maintain. Imagine working a 10-hour shift in a factory. The boss pays a wage that supposedly covers rent and food to keep the worker alive. If it takes 4 hours of labor to generate enough value to cover that daily wage, the remaining 6 hours are what Marx calls surplus labor, which creates surplus value. The worker is no longer working for themselves. The capitalist keeps the value produced in those extra 6 hours as profit. Profit isn't a reward for innovation or risk. Profit is literally just unpaid labor. For Marx, this extraction of unpaid surplus value is the hidden structural exploitation at the heart of the system, a mathematical requirement, not a moral failing. If a capitalist doesn't extract it, they don't make a profit and are destroyed by a competitor. This leads to another staggering sociological insight: commodity fetishism. Marx argued that under capitalism, the social relationships between the people who make things are deliberately hidden. When you buy a pair of sneakers, you don't see the exhausted factory worker in another country who stitched them together for 12 hours a day. You only see an object with a price tag interacting with your money. The relationship between human beings is masked, disguised as a relationship between inanimate objects, turning the commodity into a fetish with magical value, divorced from the human sweat that created it. The price tag totally shields us from the human reality. Having built this massive, sweeping critique of the entire global economy, Marx re-entered the political arena, leading to a clash of egos that defines the political left to this day. In 1864, the International Workingmen's Association, or the First International, was founded in London to unite the global working class across national borders. Marx drafted its inaugural address and became its guiding intellectual force, aiming to bring trade unionists, French socialists, and German communists under one umbrella. But then, Mikhail Bakunin entered the fray. A towering, highly charismatic Russian revolutionary and the intellectual father of modern anarchism, Bakunin was a man of action who had fought on the barricades in 1848, was sentenced to death, escaped a brutal Siberian prison camp, and traveled across America. Joining the International, he and Marx were immediately on a violent collision course. While they shared the ultimate goal of destroying capitalism, they violently disagreed on how to achieve it. Marx believed the working class needed to organize politically, capture state power, and use a transitional phase called the dictatorship of the proletariat to dismantle capitalism and defend against counter-revolution, using the state apparatus to suppress the private armies of the ultra-wealthy. Bakunin vehemently opposed this, arguing that any state apparatus is inherently oppressive, corrupting, and dictatorial. He famously warned that if you take the most ardent, pure-hearted revolutionary and give him absolute centralized state power, within a year, he will be worse than the czar he overthrew. Bakunin demanded the immediate, total abolition of all state authority from day one. Furthermore, while Marx looked to the disciplined, industrialized factory workers to lead the revolution, Bakunin believed the real revolutionary fire lay in the marginalized outcasts, peasants, and criminals, groups Marx dismissed with abysmal scorn as the lumpen proletariat. The philosophical debate devolved into an incredibly bitter, petty, and deeply personal feud. Bakunin accused Marx of being an authoritarian dictator, weaponizing horrific racist and anti-Semitic slurs against him, and even comparing him to the conservative Prussian Chancellor Bismarck. Marx fired back, accusing Bakunin of being a thief, a chaotic disorganizer, and running a secret conspiratorial society to sabotage the International. The breaking point arrived at the Hague Congress in 1872. Realizing he was losing ground to Bakunin's anarchists in Spain and Italy, Marx rigged the deck, ensuring his loyal supporters had a majority to engineer the formal expulsion of Bakunin. Then, he executed a masterful but entirely destructive political maneuver. He moved the headquarters of the General Council from London to New York City. Moving a European labor movement to New York in 1872 basically guaranteed its death, as it took weeks just to send a letter. And that was entirely the point. Marx deliberately chose to torpedo his own ship and let the First International wither and die in exile in America, rather than let Bakunin take control of it in Europe. It was the Great Schism that permanently, irreparably divided communists and anarchists to this day. The massive ideological battles were fought, and the political lines permanently drawn. But as the dust settled, Marx was growing old, sick, and exhausted, unknowingly standing on the precipice of his final, devastating odyssey. The massive ideological battles were fought, and the political lines permanently drawn. But as the dust settled, Marx was growing old, sick, and exhausted, unknowingly standing on the precipice of his final, devastating odyssey. The late 1870s and early 1880s were a period of profound physical decline and intense personal grief. He was constantly plagued by severe chronic bronchitis, pleurisy, and a lung abscess that made breathing agonizing. But the fatal blow was not medical, it was emotional. In December 1881, his lifelong companion and fiercest defender, Jenny, died of liver cancer. On the day she died, Engels looked at Marx and stated softly, "The Moor has died as well." The Moor was their affectionate nickname for Marx, referencing his dark complexion and thick black beard. Engels knew instantly that without Jenny, Karl was completely untethered from the world, utterly devastated. Fearing his lungs would literally give out in the damp London winter, his doctors ordered him to seek a warmer, drier climate. In the winter of 1882, a frail Karl Marx took a ship across the Mediterranean, arriving in Algiers in North Africa. Remarkably, this desperate trip for his health was the only time in his entire life that Karl Marx set foot outside the continent of Europe. But the journey was an absolute disaster. Seeking warmth, he arrived just as Algiers experienced its coldest, wettest winter in a decade. Marx was trapped in his hotel room, freezing, miserable, coughing relentlessly, and profoundly lonely. He wrote heartbreaking letters to Engels expressing his deep melancholy, comparing himself to a broken, aging Don Quixote living a pointless, arid existence without Jenny. While trapped in Algiers, he did something highly symbolic. He went to a local barber and shaved off his beard. The iconic, massive Zeus-like beard, the literal face of Marxism that would later be printed on millions of flags and posters, was simply gone. His daughter, Eleanor, later suggested it was his way of shedding the myth. He was shedding the heavy public persona of the revolutionary icon, perhaps recognizing that his time was ending. He returned to Europe, but the relentless tragedies were not over. In January 1883, he received the devastating news that his beloved eldest daughter, Jennichen, had died of bladder cancer at the age of 38. It was simply too much grief for one person to bear. His body finally gave out. 2 months later, on March 14, 1883, his loyal housekeeper, Lenchen, left him alone in his study for scarcely 2 minutes. When she and Engels returned, they found him sitting quietly in his armchair. He had peacefully gone to sleep and died at 64 years old. The details of his funeral are deeply haunting. The man whose ideas would shape the entire 20th century, whose name would be chanted by millions from the streets of Moscow to Beijing to Havana. His funeral at Highgate Cemetery in London was attended by just 9 to 13 people. He died practically penniless, relatively obscure, and a stateless refugee. At his graveside, Engels delivered a powerful eulogy, famously stating, "Mankind is shorter by a head, and that the greatest head of our time." Engels elevated his friend's legacy by comparing Marx's discovery of the economic law of development of human history to Charles Darwin's discovery of the law of development of organic nature. But the shadow of tragedy that followed the Marx family in those Soho slums did not end at Highgate Cemetery. The legacy of his surviving daughters is incredibly powerful, yet deeply melancholic. Eleanor, affectionately known as Tussie, became a brilliant, trailblazing socialist feminist. She was a fierce union organizer who helped lead the famous London dock strike, and the acclaimed first English translator of Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Yet, she discovered her long-term partner, Edward Aveling, had been secretly embezzling movement money and had secretly married a young actress. Heartbroken and exhausted, Eleanor committed suicide in 1898 at the age of 43 by swallowing prussic acid. Years later, in 1911, his other surviving daughter, Laura, and her husband, the prominent French socialist Paul Lafargue, died in a suicide pact, injecting themselves with hydrogen cyanide because they believed they were too old to contribute any further to the revolutionary movement. When we step back and look at the totality of this life, it is a heavy, almost Shakespearean tragedy. The aristocratic wife who gave up everything, the capitalist factory owner who funded the war against his own class, the agonizing deaths of the children, the petty political feuds, the American newspaper articles. They sacrificed absolutely everything, their health, their sanity, and their family, for a future they never lived to see. At the time of his death, Marx was a marginalized intellectual figure. Volume 1 of Das Kapital was published, but volumes 2 and 3 were just chaotic piles of messy, illegible notes that Engels would spend the rest of his own life meticulously editing and publishing. Yet, those messy notes would go on to ignite global geopolitical movements that Marx himself might never have recognized or predicted. This brings us to a final, lingering thought that perfectly captures the profound irony of his legacy. Late in his life, in 1881, Marx exchanged a series of letters with a Russian radical named Vera Zasulich. She asked him a deeply theoretical question: does Russia have to go through the brutal, grueling process of capitalist industrialization before it can possibly have a socialist revolution? Marx's answer was hesitant, but absolutely fascinating. He began to wonder if the traditional Russian peasant communes, the Obshchina, could serve as a historical shortcut. Could an agrarian peasant society, with barely any factories, skip the horrors of capitalism entirely and jump straight to communism? It is the ultimate historical irony. Karl Marx spent his entire adult life sitting at a desk in the British Museum, obsessively analyzing the mechanized, industrialized factories of Britain and Germany. He was absolutely convinced that the revolution would mathematically have to happen in the most advanced capitalist nations. Yet, the revolutions fought in his name. The massive empires toppled under his banner, ignited in the agrarian peasant societies of Russia and China. What would the man who spent decades dissecting the streets of London and Manchester make of how his theories were actually applied by Lenin in Moscow or Mao in Beijing? It raises an important question that historians, philosophers, and political scientists are still fiercely debating today. The man who dedicated his life to imposing a rigid scientific order on the chaos of history was, in the end, outmaneuvered by the unpredictable swerve of history itself. If this journey through the chaotic, contradictory, and brilliant life of Karl Marx gave you a new perspective, do not forget to like this video, share it with a friend who loves history, and hit that subscribe button. We are Legendary Lives Unveiled, and we will see you in the next one.